Okay, so this is our second build showcase video. In this video, we're going to do the Stormchaser. I don't have a particular order to these videos. Someone in the comments last time asked for Stormchaser, so that's the only reason I did it. I'll probably try and do an alternation, some sort of rotation between Warrior, Ranger, Mage, something like that. Try and repeat, so it's not all Warrior, all Mage, all Rogue, Ranger, etc. So this is a level 9 version of the Stormchaser. We're missing two very key skills at this point, Vacuum Aura and Superconductor. You can actually get Vacuum Aura at this point, but I opted to slot Skin Graft to make this fight a bit easier. Normally you wouldn't have Skin Graft, and that would be replaced by Vacuum Aura, which you can get already. Okay, so the first thing I do in this fight is I jump in with Tactical Retreat. It's a great skill for getting 1 AP on the next turn with haste and only costs 1. You do attack from elevation sometimes, so having a couple points in Huntsman doesn't hurt. And then I go ahead and cast Rain, and there are really two schools of thought on Rain. One is that it reduces the air resistance enemies have, which is extremely useful in casting before you cast an electrical type skill. The second school of thought is that you don't tend to shock yourself as much if you cast Rain afterward, because if you shock targets with electricity, then cast Rain on them, they will be stunned. So you can use it just as effectively afterward, and it tends to, prevent you from taking damage, but here I opted to do the other way around. Then I go ahead and use Adrenaline to get me some extra AP, and I go ahead and use Blinding Radiance, which is a smallish AoE that hits all the targets here, blinds a couple of them. Unfortunately, like 35-40% dodge chance isn't enough to reliably prevent you from taking damage, so I had to go ahead and use Evasion here to make sure that I didn't get hit. Okay, so it's my turn here, and you can see that I go ahead and use Dazing Bolt, which is a great AoE for this build. Probably the most stably used skill in the build. You're going to use it through Act 1 and the better part of Act 2 with regularity until you get Superconductor, which is just godly. So after Dazing Bolt, I go ahead and use Shields Up to get some more armor here while 3 of the enemies are stunned. I'm only going to get hit by that Archer. There are generally two types of builds that I make, and I would like to say there are generally two types of builds in the game, but that's probably an oversimplification. There's the offensive type builds, like I showed with the Eternal Warrior, where you're just pounding away at the enemies, trying to get them CC before they get you, which isn't too dissimilar from this build. However, there is a difference in some of these builds. They can replenish their armor with regularity, with Shields Up, Bone Cage, Armor of Frost, Fortify, skills like this, the Deflective Barrier, skills like this that allow them to withstand damage on the enemy turn, so they can attack and then buff and attack and then buff. And builds like that don't usually need Skin Graft, because by the time they get around to using their full rotation of skills, everything else is off cooldown again. So this typically happens with Mage builds because they have long cooldowns, and they typically use shields in this game. So you're going to see that a lot of my Mage builds generally just outlast damage, where the melee builds and the Ranger builds got to be a little more creative. Okay, you can see here that the 3 enemies that are stunned become unstunned and unshocked after their turn of being stunned, which is really one of the drawbacks of magic-based builds, is that you have to set essentially 2 status effects in order to get CC. In the case of air damage, you have to set shocked and then stunned. And in the case of water, you have to set chilled and then frozen. So now I have to shock these enemies and stun them, which can sometimes happen if they're wet already. But, compared to physical damage where you just knock them down, it's not quite as easy to do with, regularity. Okay, so I go ahead and use Skin Graft here, and I go ahead and cast Rain again. I was hoping to keep the water electrified, because sometimes when they have no magical armor, they'll just start their turn shocked, because the water will shock them and stun them, which does happen with the Ranger, but not the other ones, unfortunately. I hit with Blinding Radiance to blind them all and do more air damage to try and strip more armor and deal damage. And then I go ahead and pop Evasion again to make sure I am not struck. Okay, on my turn, I go ahead and use Dazing Bolt again to stun as many people as I can and kill that totem to get the Executioner bonus. And then I go ahead and use Shields Up again, to kind of rinse and repeat with this sort of build to get my armor back up while everyone is stunned. And then you can see I'm trying to figure out what to do next. I have a lot of touch ranged skills. I have Electric Discharge, but I don't really want to use it because the enemy's already stunned. And only like really electric based skills will stun and not air damage in general. So I decided to go ahead and tactical retreat over to the archer so that on my next turn I can use some of those touch ranged abilities and hopefully finish it off. Okay, so I go ahead and use Shocking Touch there and shock it, and then I thought, well, I could stun it with the Electric Discharge, which is ranged. So I go ahead and do that there just to make sure it doesn't attack me on the next turn. And then didn't really have any AP left. So I go ahead and use Bone Cage to give myself a bit of extra armor here in case that summoner decides to toss another bouncing shield at me. So on my turn I go ahead and hit the archer with Vacuum Touch, which is a great skill for 1 damage. Sets a couple of status effects, silenced and suffocating, and it only costs 1 AP, which is phenomenal. Has very short range though, which is why I teleported or jumped. So then I'm trying to figure out what to do next, and I decide to get a little creative and teleport the archer over onto the totem to take it out, get the executioner bonus, and then trying to figure out what to do. I don't really have need to use a defensive skill. The archer is silenced. So I go ahead and just wand attack it because I'm trying to finish it off here and get it down a little more. Okay, the summoner casts another totem and the archer doesn't do anything because he's silenced. And then on my turn, I go ahead and use Blinding Radiance again to finish off both of the totem and the archer. And then I just go ahead and peg the summoner once with a regular attack, and then I use Evasion just because I want to make sure I don't get hit by, any sort of physical attack. So on my turn, I go ahead and hit the summoner and the totem with a Dazing Bolt. It's the 3rd time in this fight I've used that. You can sort of see with these sort of defensive type builds, as I was saying before, that you just sort of outlast your enemies until your skills are back off cooldown, and your rotations happen a little slower than like with the Eternal Warrior, where I'm just cranking out the skills as fast as I can, hit skin graft, and then use them all over again and just end the fight quickly. Some of these types of builds you just outlast them. So after the Dazing Bolt, I go ahead and hit the summoner with Electric Discharge to do a little more damage, and then I just hit it with a wand attack to deal a little bit more. So on my turn, I go ahead and tactical retreat over, and this is the 2nd time in this fight I've done this, and this is exactly what we have this skill for, is to get you close to enemies so you can use some of the close range abilities. I hit the summoner with Shocking Touch. He's shocked but not stunned, so I go ahead and cast Rain, which makes him wet and also provides the stun status effect when the target is shocked. So now that he's stunned, I just keep wailing on him, and that pretty much concludes the fight. So this build is very, very one-dimensional. You're doing almost 100% air damage, depending on what you have on your wand. And you can see from using some of the abilities here, and you gotta be a bit smart about how you use them. Some of them don't stun targets. You would think that because they all do air damage, like the way water skills work, all have a chance to freeze, but that's just not true. Skills like Vacuum Aura, Vacuum Touch, they don't stun targets. Blinding Radiance, they don't stun targets. So when you're fighting in a group of enemies, I generally lead with those abilities. You'll see that you saw at the beginning of the fight here, I led with Blinding Radiance. And that's because like Vacuum Aura, Blinding Radiance, not only deal damage to their magic armor, but in a lot of cases they set suffocating and silence, which protects you from getting hit, and suffocation strips more magic armor. So you want to get rid of that armor so that when you use Superconductor or Dazing Bolt, it provides you with those stun status effects. So you want to try and use those skills first, followed by the ones that actually stun enemies. And another thing that you don't see here, unless you're looking at my stats real closely, I have a lot of air resistance because you tend to deal damage to yourself using this sort of build, and you really want to protect against that. Okay, so this is the level 16 version of the fight here. I did this once before for the Stormchaser video, but I was Lone Wolf then. I'm not here even though it looks like it because I got 2 characters. This is just because I used the same save and I went and changed my talents. But I just wanted to show that you can do this as a party build again later in the game, obviously. Same with the Eternal Warrior. It just gets more and more powerful, so you'll see it performs a bit better here than it did earlier in the game. Okay, so after the guy summons his thingamajigger, I tactical leap in, get close to the guy. And the Stormchaser positioning is even more important to the Stormchaser than the Eternal Warrior because a lot of your skills are AoEs, and you want to try and hit as many targets as you can with them. This fight, the enemies are spread out quite a bit more than the last one, so getting them to group up is important, and the way you do that is by line of sighting enemies, trying to get them to come to the same spot to attack you so that you can blow them all up with the same AoE. So after I go ahead and tactical retreat in here, I use Deflective Barrier, and then I use Evasion. This will allow me to deal some damage to the enemies while taking no damage during their turn. So you can see the enemies on the left sort of grouped up there. I go ahead and use Phoenix Dive here, which I've added for more mobility. And I sort of jump a little bit closer to the enemies on the left, but not so far that the enemies on the right are too far, because I want to try and be able to hit everything if I can. AoE doesn't have that big a range, but maybe on the next turn or something they'll come around the corner, and I'll be in range to hit them without having to move. So kind of contrary to what I said before in the previous video, leading with Blinding Radiance or Vacuum Aura, I go ahead and lead with Superconductor here. And that's because I have really high damage at this point in the game, and Superconductor has a really, really short cooldown, so you want to use it quickly because it'll come back quickly. So I go ahead and hit with Superconductor, I stun one of them, and then I go ahead and hit with Dazing Bolt, which kills one, giving me Executioner. And unfortunately, I don't quite stun that guy on the left side. He's just shocked. So you go ahead and cast Rain here so that he becomes stunned. So you can see the enemies are sort of grouping up around me, which is exactly what you want on this sort of build. The more people in range, the better. But I don't have a lot of AP because of Adrenaline last round, so I go ahead and pop Skin Graft here, which again is something you probably don't need in a party-based build because you're not going to make it all the way through your skills probably in one fight or maybe just one time. And I'm trying to figure out what to do. Maybe Superconductor, but it doesn't hit everyone I want, so I go ahead and use Vacuum Aura because it has a huge AoE, set silence and suffocating. I get the Executioner bonus here, and then I go ahead and use Dazing Bolt on the guys on the bottom right to stun them, and that pretty much concludes that turn. Okay, on my next turn, I only have 2 AP because of Adrenaline again. Decide to pop Evasion to make sure I don't get killed while I'm waiting for my AP to come back. And I hit Armor of Frost because these guys do magical damage. Okay, so at this point I want a Superconductor, but I can only hit 2 targets, so I decide to tactical retreat over to my left just a little bit, seeing if I can get that third guy in range. Probably could have walked, actually, but at least I got haste from tactical retreat for my next turn. And luckily, I was able to get all 3 in range, so I go ahead and use Superconductor, get all 3, kill 1, and then finish off another one with Electric Discharge. So lastly, Phoenix dive over to the last guy and hit him with Shocking Touch, which finishes him off, and that concludes the fight. So you can see this build, this fight went much, much faster than the level 9 one. It's much more powerful at this point. This isn't Low Wolf again. And this is just a really, really fun build. It has lots of AoEs, ones that look really cool. You have a lot of CC like you do with the Eternal Warrior. I think probably, you know, between the two-handed warrior type build, this build, and the Titleist, I think those are probably, you know, my favorite 3 builds, because they're 3 builds that, you know, deal pretty good damage and have tons of CC, and CC is just so important in this game. So, the downside of this build is it's not very good in a traditional party that kind of goes either, you know, split damage, you know, like a 2 and 2, 2 physical, 2 magic damage type builds. It's very, very good in an all magic damage party. And in fact, the Stormchaser will be your tank per se in that sort of role because of evasion, because of the fact that it has large AoEs and that have to be close range. You have to be close. Whereas, you know, you can take Geomancer and shoot from range, you can take Pyromancer and shoot from range, and you can take Titleist and shoot from range. You need to be up close and personal if you're going to just spec Aerothurge and try and run an Aerothurge only type build. But it's super fun. I totally recommend it. I'm not sure which build we're going to do next. I'm thinking either maybe Juggernaut or Frost Paladin. You know, if you guys have one you want to see, go ahead and let us know in the comments below.